you. Thank you so much, and good morning. I am excited for the discussion that this group will have, and we all bring, I think, a different perspective, and probably vastly different perspectives to this topic. So the subject of my talk this morning is around a component, definitely not the totality of the idea and the notion of violence against women on the border and violence against migrating women. My focus in particular will be around the experiences of violence for women migrating from Central America, as Mo mentioned, to the United States from the perspective of the United States on this side of that journey. A little background about the title, Salía de uno y me metí en otro. I will be using some quotes from my dissertation research that will be in Spanish, so I'll try to talk through those as I go for those of you who don't speak Spanish. But this one in particular comes from something a woman that I'll call Hortensia told me during an interview for my dissertation research. And more or less, she was saying that in leaving or fleeing one set of violent circumstances and a violent relationship, she found herself in the midst of another set, right? As a sketch, Hortensia is a 35-year-old Guatemalan mother of 5. She was in a domestic violence relationship that she fled from Guatemala to come to the US. She was deported back to Guatemala, back into the same situation. She fled again, and in fleeing and crossing through Mexico, she experienced sexual violence along the way. She was then held hostage and exploited for labor around the area of the border from Texas and Mexico. During the time of her being held, her daughter back in Guatemala, her oldest daughter, was murdered on the street. She eventually found her way to Austin, where she was held again and exploited for labor. She eventually escaped, found a stable job, has since gotten a T visa, and has joined 2 of her kids with her in the United States. And I give this brief sketch because it begins to give us a sense of the complexity and the multiplicity of violences that some women experience as they migrate and after they migrate. While we often tend to think of migration as this very linear process of leaving one point of departure A and arriving in one point of destination B, I think this also begins to give us a sense of how flexible the migration process can be. Likewise, I think we often tend to think of the types of violence, sexual violence, domestic violence, human trafficking, gang violence, as these very set, distinct, and separate categories. And so I think the work that I've been doing and Hortensia's example also show us the ways that these violences actually interact with each other, right? And so those categories and those titles begin to collapse a little bit and unravel. Before I go any further, though, I want to say a few words about violence and about talking about violence to all of us here. So we know that 1/3 of the women in the world experience some kind of domestic violence in the course of their lifetime. We also know that 1 in 5 college women will experience sexual assault during their college years. And so I think that means that within a group like this, we definitely have survivors of violence among us. It's important that we are gentle with each other as we talk about these issues. And it's also important to remember that talking about violence often generates strong emotional reactions, and to take care of yourselves during the day and after today. And so I've just listed 2 resources up here. One is a community resource, and one is a university resource for us to remember. So I also want to give you a sense of who I am and the perspectives that I'm going to be bringing, which will also give you a sense of the perspectives I'm not bringing, but that hopefully are brought here together in this room today for a discussion later. In talking about this topic, I'm going to be drawing from several resources, or several points of information. One of those is my own direct social work practice, as Mo mentioned, with refugees and immigrants over the course of the years, more recently with women who are detained in family detention or in all-women detention facilities, and I think we'll hear a good bit more about detention during the panel. I'll also be drawing from scholarly literature and the empirical evidence on this topic, and then from my own research, both as part of the team at IDVSA that Mo mentioned, but also my more recent dissertation research, which focuses directly on Central American women fleeing violence and experiencing violence along the way. I want to say that I won't be talking about all the kinds of experiences with violence that happen to people who are crossing the border. So I won't be talking about all the different people, the growing numbers of people crossing the border from Mexico into the United States that we're starting to see that are not necessarily from Central America. So the growing numbers of women from different parts of Asia and different parts of Africa, that will be absent from my talk. I also want to note that I will not be talking about the experiences that may be similar or may be different for either men or the LGBTQ community. Okay? And some of these are two folks who write about researching this topic that I greatly respect, and I think both of those quotes give us the sense that what our research can never be complete around this. And so I want to acknowledge that what I'm talking about today will give one little drop, but not the whole picture. So another piece I want to acknowledge is that while I'm not a historian and this is not the focus of my work, that it's important and even critical to recognize the historical context of the region, the regional and historical context that we're talking about. So important pieces of that context, of course, include the histories of colonization and meddling and intervention by US government and US businesses and other global north entities that have resulted in the displacement of peoples in the region. Histories of political conflict, internal armed conflict, civil war, and the impact of globalization on poverty and economic instability. So all of these things combine with other factors too to result in high levels of internal displacement, high levels of poverty, organized crime, homicide, and a generally militarized post-conflict situation. And all these things also are elements in motivations to migrate for folks from this region, in addition to high rates of detention and high rates of deportation back to the region, right? Deportation, pardon me. So another element that is important to consider more recent which was referenced earlier, is last summer and last spring's crisis and surge in unaccompanied children and women and children who are migrating from this region into the US. Because I think the unsettling and even sort of the panic that incurred in the media and in our communities has set the stage for what's happening currently in terms of, particularly in terms of how women are detained and or deported, children as well. Another big element that's important for us to consider, and I know that there's a whole session on femicide later, but femicide or the killing of women, the highest rates of femicide in the world are in El Salvador, and Guatemala and Honduras are not far behind. And these are trends that have been increasing over the past 10 years. So throughout the process of migration for women from Central America in particular, there exists what I would call a constellation of violences enacted upon women. While I resist the idea that we can break up that migration process into these linear segments of pre-migration, during migration, and post-migration, I'm also going to actually use those and contradict myself and use those to help us think about the ways that the empirical evidence and women's everyday experiences play out during those periods of time. What this larger idea of violence is. So, which will include domestic violence, which is a pattern of control and coercion that includes physical violence, can include sexual violence, economic control and coercion, emotional and psychological abuse. In addition to sexual violence and or rape, gang violence, and larger ideas of state violence. So in thinking about pre-migration or the situation for women in their home countries, again, global estimates suggest that about 1/3 of the world's women are exposed to domestic violence or interpersonal violence. There are also some suggestions that 50% of women in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador have experienced domestic violence in the course of their lifetime. So a little larger than the global estimates. The nature of violence against women in the Northern Triangle ranges from everyday experiences of domestic violence up through femicide, as we saw before. And while it's useful to explore these everyday experiences of violence, which we'll be doing, it is critical, again, like being able to look at the historical and geopolitical nature of the region, it's also critical that we recognize that these exist within these broader social structures of oppression, right? And to not lose sight of that. There's also a sense that these kinds of violence possibly impact to a greater degree women who are indigenous and women from ethnic minorities in these countries. So how does this impact whether or not women migrate? The empirical evidence is really still very new on this topic. There's a lot of writing about how experience of violence is a motivation to migrate, but very little empirical evidence to date yet on that actual topic. So what are women saying about this? I think that's a lot of words up there, but one of the things that I'm hearing from women is this idea of the normalization of violence against women and girls. One woman, let's see, it's the top one, Maria, told me that for me it's normal that somebody rapes me or touches me, because my family has told me that it's very normal that we as women, we don't have rights to defend ourselves. The men are the ones with these rights. So there's that sense of normalization of violence, right? There's also a sense that when violence does happen to women, there's not an access to justice or an open sort of access to finding safety, either in family systems or in the criminal justice system. What we hear a lot about is the high rates of impunity. So some of these women too spoke about that. Isabel said that essentially back home in Honduras, we sort of lived in violence. Women are beaten, their faces cut, whatever the man wants to do. He might spend a day in jail, and then that's it. And I hear the same thing over and over from women, right? So what that means is that if you're living in a situation where you're not safe, leaving and talking to the police is, one, not going to result in much help, right? Maybe a day where the perpetrator spends in jail. But two, oftentimes what you hear is, okay, then he comes out and he's madder, so the violence maybe escalates, right? So other places where women might look for support, family systems, for example, also sometimes are not extremely helpful. Because of this normalization of violence, families are often saying, go back and endure the violence. So there's this sense of inescapability, or not having a place to go. There's also a sense that where this gang violence and the broader sort of street or urban violence plays in, and that is that threats that are made to women about what will happen to them if they leave are very real threats, right? And so any threat to a woman that she will be killed is actually a threat that feels incredibly palpable to folks. They see it on the news, right? The idea of femicide is out there and part of people's realities. So that's kind of home countries. In terms of violence that can be part of the migration experience itself, there's a general vulnerability to all kinds of violence throughout the migration process. There's one of the things that makes this migration process, particularly for women with few financial resources, who are traveling by foot or by train or by bus more than 1,500 miles and across more than one border, all of those factors play into many spaces and many opportunities for violence to be enacted on them. So again, here we have very, very little empirical evidence about what's actually happening. What we do have are human rights organizations, testimonios, and things like that that tell us about what's happening to women. So we hear that between 60 and 80% of women are raped as they cross through Mexico and or crossing borders. A lot of that information comes from migrant shelters, which are dotted along these pathways, these migrant routes. Where I'm hearing more about rape as a price of passage, this idea that in order to cross over, right, rape is going to be part of the deal, right, part of the negotiation. Where I'm hearing more about that is closer to the Guatemala border with Mexico and on both sides of the Texas-US border, right? And so many times women in traveling up through this passage, they are either held various times and being extorted for money, and during that holding, oftentimes sexual violence is part of the deal, is part of that experience. And so that might happen, again, down on the southern part or the northern part, or again in the United States. Unfortunately, for many women that I've talked to in my dissertation research, this process has happened 2, 3, 4 times, right? So being held for extortion is, and experiencing sexual violence during that time is something that might happen multiple times for women. There's also an idea in the media, it's not really borne out in empirical evidence yet either though, about an anticipation of rape, about the idea that women who are leaving and are migrating through Mexico have a sense that this is possible. So either the idea of taking Depo-Provera or some kind of pregnancy prevention, knowing that rape might be part of the experience, or there are also reports of coyotes or the guides telling women they need to take it to prevent pregnancy along the way. Similar to the experience of violence in the home countries, immigration status and race and ethnicity are also part of the added vulnerabilities to women while they're migrating. So one of the things that I think is interesting is that when women talk about being exposed to sexual violence, at least in my dissertation research, they're talking about two things. One, they're talking about the actual experience of sexual violence. They're also talking about being exposed to witnessing sexual violence against other women and girls. And so this second quote is about that rape that happens during literally the crossing of the border, the crossing of the river into Texas, and knowing and seeing that other girls and women were being raped and not being able to do anything about it. So I think that's a considerable thing that maybe hasn't been touched on very much in the research, is not only your own personal experience, but having to see it and not having any recourse, right? So unfortunately, we think about the violence people are fleeing, the violence they're experiencing along the way. We like to think that maybe somebody finds safety when they come to some kind of settling place in the US or in Texas. And unfortunately, this is also not the case. In fact, most of the scholarly literature is about this part of the journey. It's what people in the field might call, or in some fields might call, battered immigrant women, right? There's a good deal of information out there about that. There's an idea that Latina immigrants experience a wide range and higher rates of various kinds of violence than non-immigrants, and that undocumented immigrants as well experience higher rates of violence. There's also an indication that for women who are already in a relationship when they migrate to the US, that many women experience either the initiation of violence after coming to the US, when their relationship has not been violent before, or an escalation in violence, right? And so some of this has to do with the kinds of control and coercion and the specific positions of immigrant women, particularly undocumented immigrant women. And some of the things that perpetrators use to control and coerce women. One of the big ones, right, of course, is fear of deportation, using the fear of deportation as a way to control someone. So, So we're thinking that these kinds of specific positions of immigrant women can exacerbate the perpetrator's use of violence and exacerbate the women's experience, and also begin to limit and, well, just limit access to some kind of support or services, be it in the criminal justice system or among family and friends and social support. While the scholarly literature has really focused on domestic violence and battered immigrant women, what I'm hearing from women includes lots of different kinds of violence, right, even after coming into the United States. I've already talked about being held and extorted. And this quote from Gilberta says that she was held for 3 or 4 days, and she told the guy that was holding her, this was not being held by a gang for extortion. This was being held by a person who had helped her migrate. She said, I want to leave, I want to work, I want to pay you the money that I owe you. And he said, no, I don't want money, I want you to be my woman. And she said, well, I don't know you, and I don't want this kind of life, I want to move ahead with my kids. And so this illustrates, again, just the other kinds of things that happen to women once they arrive here on this side of the border. So I think while it's incredibly important to expose these everyday experiences of violence, it's also important that we don't present migrant women as this monolithic body of women with no agency and no choice, right, and no strategies for resistance. And actually, I'm hearing a lot from women to suggest two sort of kinds of resistance, you might call it. One is the idea of micro-resistance, and micro not being used as a way to demean or make smaller these strategies, but as a way to indicate these everyday experiences of resisting the kinds of violence that women are exposed to. This is a term used by Polly Wilding and Mo Hume. Polly Wilding was here not too long ago talking about this very issue. And so this looks a lot of different ways for women, right? This idea of micro-resistance can be something, it can be the fleeing itself. It can be small things, well, we might think of the small as wearing pants to resist violence or to decrease the likelihood of being raped. Dressing like a man while migrating. I talked to one woman who spent a week in the municipal trash dump in Reynosa, who talked about making her body physically repulsive and dirty to reduce the possibility that she would be raped. A lot of the micro-resistance strategies also include faith and prayer, the use of prayer and singing that women spoke to me about. So in addition to micro-resistance or women using their own sort of internal strengths, there's another idea of co-survival and shared survival among people that are traveling together and among people whose ties are more transnational. So that can look a lot of different ways. Women are part of this kind of collective support or resistance with fellow migrants. So that includes keeping people safe while coming on and off of trains. It includes literally like sharing shoes. One woman talked to me about having crossed across the river into Texas, and oftentimes the coyotes will ask women to take off all their clothes while they do that, and they put them in bags to keep their clothes dry. Sometimes the bags are lost, et cetera. And so one woman talked to me about having crossed over and she was naked and immigration found them and the lights, come on. And another migrant woman throwing her clothes to put on. So these can be, sort of within groups, fellow migrants helping each other. There's also a great sense of shared survival in the United States, shared shelter and childcare arrangements and jobs and that kind of thing. I'm going to come back to that one if we have time. So transnational motherhood is not part of my work, but it's impossible to ignore this aspect. The identity of women as mothers and how that plays into their resistance to violence and their strategies for survival is just constant. And so that looks a couple of different ways. What I'm finding is that motherhood is a motivation to migrate in and of itself. So for example, Maria says that she's talking about her children. They have a right to live a future without violence, without problems, without threats of death. Isabel talked about she didn't want her own history with violence to be repeated in her children. And then Sierra told me that she brought her daughter from Honduras so that her daughter wouldn't be raped. And this was an example of someone who had help from family in the US to pay for her trip to the US to escape a very lethal abusive relationship she was in. But the help was only for 2 people. So she could bring herself and she could bring one of her 2 kids. And she had 2 preteen kids, a boy and a girl. And she talked about this decision that she had. Do I bring the girl, who will very likely experience sexual violence if I leave her here? Or do I bring the boy, who will also is in the age range of beginning to be recruited by gangs, right? She decided to bring her daughter, thinking that she would be able to protect her daughter from rape. And so in this way, right, someone's own experience of violence gets laid on the decisions they make for their family and their children as well. So in addition, though, women, frequently talk about their children as their source of strength. This is how they're doing what they're doing. This is how they maintain the motivation to move forward. And then I won't talk about this, but women's separation from their own children is well documented in the literature. These are situations where families live apart transnationally for many years and is a source of great anxiety, shame, guilt, a host of feelings for women that are separated from their children. So in light of those things, the constellation of violences, the ways that women resist and survive together, and the identity as a mother, I want to talk a little bit about our very contemporary response to women fleeing domestic violence and experiencing violence along the way. While we have many policies that allow for women to seek immigration relief via asylum and various visas, I think we're seeing a growing trend of those avenues being closed, right? The spaces for immigration relief being made tighter and smaller. So one example of that is this reinitiation of family detention. And in addition to families being detained again, where we had sort of decided as a country to not detain families, in addition to families being detained again, women are also being denied bond. So previously, women, if a woman was detained, for example, in Hutto here near Austin, Carnes or Dilley, which are south of San Antonio, getting out on bond would mean getting back out into the community where you could then argue your immigration case in immigration court. But more and more we're seeing that bond is being denied as a way to send a message back to Central America for folks to not migrate. So in addition to that, and detention is like prison, I know we're going to hear a lot more about that in the next panel. There's also continued violence within the prison system, within detention. And then the literature talks about the impact of detention. So there's been some research looking at mental health outcomes of those detained versus those not detained, and much higher rates of depression, anxiety, and PTSD among people who are detained. So when we think about everything we just talked about, what women are coming with, these experiences of violence and trauma, and then what they're met with, which is a detention system that adds to that and exacerbates that, minus any kind of support services for women who are inside detention, we, of course, have a major problem. I think another thing that's important to look at is the sort of parallel processes of control. So if we look at the way that detention controls women's actions, women's behaviors throughout the day, and we look at the tactics that traffickers and abusers use to control women, they're in some ways, very similar, right? So some of those ways that women are controlled in detention include lights being put on at different times of day or being left on at night. These siren kind of sounds that go off periodically, what you may have heard of, the hieleras, or the ice boxes that oftentimes women and children are put in for 3 or 4 days before being moved to another detention facility. Literally physical acts of sexual abuse and harassment. One woman talked to me about when she went to the cafeteria in the detention center, there was a line painted on the floor. And she was told she had to walk the line and couldn't look in either direction as she got her food. So just highly controlled settings, right? I won't go into these pictures because I think, Bob, you probably will be later. But one interesting thing to note is if you see, these are pictures from Carnes County Center, which detention center is painted over in white there. You'll see the American flag, the Texas flag, the Department of Homeland Security flag, and then GEO flag. And so that's the for-profit business that runs the detention facilities where women are detained. Am I making that sound? One thing that I think is interesting about this idea of immigration detention and border patrol and the various folks that may apprehend women after they cross the border is that I hear different things from women. So on the one hand, some women tell me that it was actually a relief. So I was fleeing violence, I was experiencing all these horrors along the way. When Border Patrol found me, I was so glad. So that first quote is from Anita, who said that, I was grateful that immigration caught me. Whereas the other women, we were all mistreated and beaten, and they wanted to keep going. But she actually was praying that immigration would find her because she knew that if they didn't, this is right on the other side of the border, right in Texas, that these things would continue to her. On the other hand, right, I think what we most often hear comes from these other quotes. Telma told me that, consider being given an order of deportation, right? It was a big shock to me because I was so afraid. I had so much fear. I came here to save my life. And if I was sent back to Honduras again, I would lose my life. And the fear had me trapped. Maria also told me that when she got here, these Border Patrol guys, these tall, blonde-haired guys came off of the four-wheelers, or the four-wheelers, and they said, "Don't be scared, we're immigration." And she said it was the worst fear she'd ever felt. That it was so much that she kind of couldn't contain herself and couldn't stop crying. Because she said, I knew that immigration might not understand me. They wouldn't understand my reasons for coming or for leaving. And then there's this other element that women experience when they're interacting with immigration, and that is a sense of not really understanding the process, not knowing what's going to happen, and not knowing what they need to do. And so Hortensia below here says that they told me I had to sign my deportation papers, and I was crying, and because I just didn't know anything. My mind had been closed. And so I think some of that is lack of information and awareness about what's happening and how to get around it. But a lot of it also is that response to trauma, right? And having been oftentimes for many months in a series of constant shifting circumstances, constantly trying to find safety, right? And continuing to feel in that state in the detention setting. So I know that a big part of today is to talk about policy responses. And so I think I won't go through these. We have so many options, right, around policy and practice responses for women on this side, right? Immigration reform, what we do about detention centers, et cetera. There's plenty to talk about, maybe about migrant rights and protection of people who are migrating while they're migrating. We could also talk about how to protect people in their home countries, how to make access to justice greater, how to reduce impunity, right? And yet I think that while those are all important, we also all balance this, or we should be having discussions around balancing the need for immediate safety and security of women, for these immediate fixes, with this other part that's maybe a little more difficult, which is the idea of, okay, how do we dismantle these systems that create violence in the first place? How do we dismantle systems that perpetuate and maintain violence for migrating people? How do we dismantle structures that keep people from being able to move about the world freely? So I think this is not something that I feel like I've come to a good place about. I don't know if there's somebody has, I'd like to hear about that, but how we really do balance these things. This immediate real need, you know, there are women right now in family detention whose stories are being put out on Facebook, for those of you who follow in family detention. That with, okay, how do we actually take apart the system completely? And try to be doing both of those things at the same time.